Hello, America. I'm Mark Levin, and this is Life, Liberty, and Levin, and it's an honor to have Dr. David Berlinski with us. How are you, sir?
Oh, I'm just fine. Thank you for having me.
Well, thank you for coming all the way from Paris to our little place.
It was endless.
It was endless. Okay. Imagine 100 years ago. Now, that was endless.
It was worse. My trip was
worse. David Berlinski, I want to talk today with you, and you're uniquely qualified to do this, about evolution, science, and progressivism, because there's a link through them all. And you've written about this and spoken about this many, many times. You received your PhD in philosophy from Princeton University, later a postdoctoral fellow in mathematics and molecular biology at Columbia University. I'm glad I didn't take any of those courses. Senior fellow in the Discovery Institute Center for Science and Culture. You've taught philosophy, mathematics, English at Stanford, Rutgers, City University of New York, and in Paris. And you're now the editor of Inference, International Review of Science. Well, let's get started. You wrote a book about a decade ago that I read about a decade ago. And in doing this program, I started to think about it, and I said, I think it's important that we have this discussion about science, evolution, progressivism. And I want to start where you started. Let me read you one paragraph. I'm a secular Jew, you write. My religious education did not take. I can barely remember a word of Hebrew. I cannot pray. I've spent more years than I care to remember in studying mathematics and writing about the sciences. Yet, as you wrote in the preface of this book, the book that follows is in some sense a defense of religious thought and sentiment. Biblical verses are the least of it. A defense is needed because none has been forthcoming. The discussion has been ceded to men who regard religious belief with frivolous contempt. Their books have in recent years poured from every press, and although differing widely in their style, they're identical in their message, because scientific theories are true, religious beliefs must be false. From your book, The Devil's Delusion, Atheism and Its Scientific Pretensions. And that is the thesis. That is the foundational point of your book. Can you expand on that?
Well, something particular and peculiar seems to have come over American intellectual life, Anglo-American intellectual life, perhaps 20 years ago. In the 1950s and 1960s, the position that was academically tolerated was a kind of cheerful agnosticism with respect to the religious tradition of mankind. Could be with respect to God's existence, maybe, maybe not. But this isn't an issue that vexes us profoundly as members of the scientific community. That all changed. Now a kind of very, very vociferous and dogmatic atheism has become obligatory in the scientific community. There are exceptions. There are always going to be exceptions. For all I know, some distinguished physicist may be plotting jihad. I have no idea. But by and large, atheism has replaced any kind of tolerant and forbearing agnosticism as the de facto standard in Anglo-American scientific intellectual life. Mm-hmm. And as a result, the religious tradition, that is a very, very long 5,000-year-old tradition, has been made into an object of faint derision among sophisticated men and women, much to the consternation of people who deeply, deeply admire that tradition. And that, I think, is a change in the diapason of life that we need to pay attention to. It's relatively new. I think it started around 1980, 1985. But it has become an accelerating force in intellectual life. If you are minded to be a serious Christian, or an extremely devout and Orthodox Jew, or even a serious Muslim, better not go into the scientific community and tell your fraternity brothers that that is what you are. Best to keep your mouth closed. Mm-hmm. And I think that's generally true. It's among the various topics about which it is not a particularly good idea to make broadcast your views.
And then you add, following up on your point, no scientific theory touches on the mysteries that the religious tradition addresses. A man asking why his days are short is not disposed to turn to algebraic quantum field theory for the answer. The answers that prominent scientific figures have offered are remarkable in their shallowness. They hypothesize that we are nothing more than cosmic accidents have been widely accepted by the scientific community. And you say, basically, science has nothing to say about life and love and death and meaning.
Hardly a controversial point, is it? I mean, if I am asking certain kinds of questions, look around you. There's something there. Open your eyes. You're struck by the existence of the universe. Why is that there? You look at the answers forthcoming from the physics community. They can be described in one of two ways. Well, what do you expect? We're here. Therefore, there's something there. Or it's kind of an accident. These are not the kind of answers intelligent men and women are searching for. They correspond to no deep intellectual need. They're frivolous. Physics really has nothing to tell us, for example, about the origins and appearance of the universe. It has a lot of interesting things to say about cosmology, but it's not the same question. The most radical question you can ask is, why is there something, anything, rather than what? Nothing. Well, why is there? It's perfectly possible to propose that there could have been nothing whatsoever. I don't mean some pre-existing stuff. I mean nothing. Well, that's not the world we live in. How come? It's a good question. What's your answer? And when you actually look at the physicist or the biologist or the chemist, their answer is, we know how it happened. We open our eyes too. There's something. And we can explain the origin of all that by appealing to some pre-existing something. Are you satisfied with that? If not, well, you're not scientifically literate. Lawrence Krauss makes exactly that same argument. Well, the reason the universe popped into existence was a pre-existing quantum field from which it arose by a probabilistic
And they have
measure.
no real solid idea, do they?
None whatsoever.
And yet, they continue to push their theories out as if it's science.
Well, let's be fair. Wouldn't you do the same thing if you were a leading physicist? I sure would. If I had a theory that deep down I knew was no good, but there were all sorts of emoluments, richness, awards, prestige associated with, I would push it for all it's worth too.
Is this why we get these arguments about climate change where the same scientists can't tell you?
I'm talking about the top physicists. Climate change,
okay.
we've got to go down that ladder
Is
all
that right?
the way into the bottom.
And yet, for a lot of us, it's just a mush out there. In other words, you're saying the top physicists, and what I'm saying is, when we take a look at climate change, we have a community that can't tell us the temperature in a week within 10 degrees, but they can tell us the temperature in 100 years within a 1 degree. And what I'm saying is, you're saying these top physicists, but isn't it pervasive? Isn't this a pervasive problem throughout science?
To a certain extent. Look, science is an enormous enterprise. How many guys, how many women, men and women, affirm themselves as scientists worldwide today? Do you happen to have the number? It's 7 million. 7 million people are engaged in the scientific enterprise. And of course, you're going to find very repetitive sociological patterns when there's something as important as the environment or climate. You're going to find groups forming, factions splitting off from the initial group, a tremendous amount of propaganda, elaborate approaches to government resources. There's a great deal of money to be had, and it's not coming from the private sector, it's coming from the federal government. When I talk about fundamental questions about the origin of the universe, we're appealing to the very top of the intellectual ladder. When I talk about climate change, we're talking about some competent people, not many, some competent people with moderately conflicting views, both about the origins of climate change. Yes, the world is getting warmer. The nature of climate change, the reliability of the climatic models, the theories that go into them, and prognostications for the future. It's not entirely clear exactly which group has the most overwhelming and persuasive evidence.
Well, let's talk about the top, if you think this fellow, at least arguably, Darwin. A lot of theories, a lot of arguments, a lot of science, so to speak. What is Darwinianism? What is that?
Well, Darwin comes a mid-19th century figure. 1859, he published what is arguably his masterpiece, The Origin of Species. And the question that Darwin asked himself was a question that all of the 19th century biologists were asking. What is the nature of life? What is the origin of individual species? How did life emerge from inorganic matter? And what are the dynamic laws that change one species into another, if there is such a thing as a change of species? Don't forget, alchemy promoted a very similar thesis when it said base metals could be transmuted into gold. It was an argument for transmutation of elements. Well, Darwin provided an alchemical explanation for biology. Species could be transformed into other species. Well, how can this come about? We don't see it every day. It comes about because there are small variations within each species, and these variations are seized upon by the mechanism of natural selection, which simply means some survive, some don't survive. Over vast periods of time, these small variations accumulate. They converge on a different structure, and various different structures in turn converge on a new body plan, a new organism, a new species, a new entry in the vast pharmacopoeia of life. That's Darwinism. And it's a position which is being increasingly held as a secular doctrine, comparable to the book of Genesis.
Was he right?
I have a lot of doubts. I have a lot of doubts, and so do other people. There are many places when one looks at Darwinism, when one says, hey, look, this just isn't a scientific theory. It's a collection of anecdotes. Why did the giraffe develop such a long neck? Well, he wanted to reach the trees on the top. Well, how come other animals didn't develop the long neck? Well, they didn't want to reach the trees on the top. How come certain kinds of European eels have to swim across the Atlantic in order to mate? Other kinds of eels are perfectly happy fornicating close to home. Well, it worked for one seal, didn't work for the other. Why aren't women born with tails like cats? Well, women don't seem to need the tails, even though it would make them even more alluring than they are. Why don't cats rule the world, considering they have every reason and every opportunity to do so? Well, they're content being our domestic masters. I mean, the anecdotes pile on interminably, and there's no fundamental leading principle.
Do you find that most atheists, more prominent atheists, embrace Darwinism?
Every last one.
And why do they do that?
Because it's a secular myth. Even atheists need some compelling myth, how we got here, what we're doing here, what our purpose is. How we got here, it was an accident. What are we doing here? We have no idea. What is our purpose? It's replication, fornication and replication. That's about it. But it's a very viable myth. People believe it. They act according to it.
And it also doesn't tolerate much, as you're right, and as people experience, it doesn't tolerate much religion or people of faith.